My name is Olivia Grant, and I learned the price of love early in life. When you lose your parents at 7, you learn that love is both precious and fragile. When you spend 3 years watching your grandmother, the woman who raised you, who taught you prayers in broken Sicilian, who held your hand through every nightmare, slowly forget your name, you learn that love sometimes means watching someone slip away piece by piece. And when you're 26, drowning in $70,000 of medical debt from trying to keep that grandmother comfortable in her final days, you learn that love has a cost the world measures in numbers you can never pay back. But I never expected that love would find me again in the most unlikely place, in a mansion in Connecticut, in the middle of the night, caring for a dying man whose son would make me question everything I thought I knew about safety, danger, and where my heart truly belonged. There's a particular kind of silence that exists in the moments before death, a hushed anticipation, as if the whole world is holding its breath. I'd learned to recognize it over 6 months of night shifts in Giovanni Santoro's bedroom, where November rain had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. His breathing changed first. Not dramatically, just a subtle catch, a hesitation between inhales that my trained instincts caught before any machine could. I set down my worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, Giovanni's favorite, which he'd asked me to read aloud on the good days, and moved to his bedside with the quiet grace I'd perfected in 27 years of learning to be invisible. "Mr. Santoro," I whispered, pressing 2 fingers gently against his wrist. His pulse fluttered beneath my touch like a frightened bird, irregular and weakening. "Can you hear me?" Those dark eyes that nurses whispered about in the break rooms of hospitals I'd never been important enough to work in, eyes that supposedly once commanded boardrooms and back alleys with equal authority, opened halfway. Through the haze of morphine and exhaustion, they found mine and held on like I was an anchor in a storm. He nodded. Just once. But in that gesture was everything we'd built together over these months, the afternoons I'd spent reading to him, the times I'd held his hand through the worst of the pain, the stories he'd shared about his childhood in Italy when the medication made him forget to guard his words. "I'm going to call your family now," I said, my voice steady despite the ache spreading through my chest. "Is that all right?" Another nod. Then his weathered hand moved on the blanket, a small gesture, but I understood. I'd learned his language, this dying man who'd been kinder to me than almost anyone in my adult life. I took his hand in both of mine. His skin felt like delicate paper, cool to the touch, the warmth already beginning its slow retreat from his extremities. It had been happening for days, this gradual withdrawal, and I documented each change with clinical precision while feeling my heart break a little more with each notation. "They'll be here soon," I promised, squeezing gently. "I won't leave you." The phone number programmed under the simple entry marked N seemed to glow in the low light of the bedroom. Nicholas Santoro. The son I'd spoken to exactly twice in 6 months, both conversations brief, professional, almost cold. He always asked the same questions: pain levels, medication adjustments, my assessment of time remaining. His voice carried traces of something Mediterranean, smoothed and sophisticated by what I assumed were years of American education and business. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the unholy hour. Yes. Not hello. Not a question. Just an acknowledgement, sharp and ready, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Mr. Santoro, this is Olivia Grant." My voice was calm, practiced, giving nothing away. "You should come now. Your father's condition has deteriorated significantly in the last hour." Silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. I counted, a nervous habit from my nursing assistant training, where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. In the background, I heard movement, fabric rustling, a door closing, the unmistakable sounds of someone already in motion. 20 minutes, he said. The line went dead. I adjusted Giovanni's pillows, checked the 4-drip, morphine and saline, comfort care only now, and increased the oxygen flow by the smallest increment. The agency that had hired me 6 months ago had been explicit in their instructions, delivered by a woman whose designer suit probably cost more than my entire wardrobe: keep him comfortable, maintain his dignity, never ask questions about the armed guards who patrolled the grounds at all hours, or the visitors who arrived in expensive cars speaking rapid Italian with their hands as much as their voices. The pay was exceptional. 3 times what I'd made at any hospital, enough to finally start making real dents in the mountain of medical debt that had crushed me since my grandmother's death. The isolation didn't bother me, I'd grown used to being alone. First by circumstance, then by necessity, and finally by choice, because alone meant safe, and safe meant no one could disappoint you or leave you or cost you everything you had left. Giovanni's eyes found mine again in the dim light. He lifted one finger, beckoning me closer with the last of his strength. When I leaned down, bringing my ear close to his lips, he whispered something in Italian, his voice barely audible over the quiet hiss of the oxygen machine. Grazie, cara mia. Tu sei stata la luce nel mio bio. Thank you, my dear. You have been the light in my darkness. I didn't speak Italian fluently, but my grandmother had taught me enough Sicilian dialect to recognize the words, to understand the depth of what he was saying. He wasn't thanking me for the medical care, for the medications administered on schedule or the vitals carefully recorded. He was thanking me for treating him like a person instead of just another dying patient, for reading to him on long afternoons, for not flinching when men with guns stood outside his door, for seeing the man beneath the legend. You're welcome, I whispered back, my throat tight. You made these months easier than you know. You reminded me why I chose this work in the first place. And it was true. Somewhere between the first week's awkward professionalism and the 6th month's comfortable familiarity, Giovanni Santoro had become more than a patient. He'd shared stories about his mother's cooking, about summers in Sicily when the world was simpler, about the wife he'd lost 20 years ago and still missed every single day. He'd asked about my grandmother, had listened with genuine interest as I described her stubborn refusal to speak English even after 50 years in America, her insistence on making pasta by hand every Sunday, her collection of prayers for every possible occasion. He'd never made me feel like hired help. In a world that had spent years making me feel small and insignificant, too poor, too uneducated, too burdened by debt to matter, Giovanni Santoro had made me feel seen. Headlights swept across the rain-streaked windows at 4:03. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet mansion, followed by multiple sets of footsteps crunching on the gravel drive. Then the heavy front door opened 2 floors below, and I heard the security guard stationed in the hallway speak in a deferential tone I'd never heard him use before. The footsteps on the stairs were purposeful, controlled, efficient. Military precise. I straightened my scrubs, cheap, practical, the same set I'd been wearing for 3 years, and stepped back from the bed, giving the family the space they deserved. The door opened. And Nicola Santoro filled the doorway in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size, though he was tall, easily over 6 feet of lean, dangerous grace. He wore a charcoal suit despite the hour, the jacket unbuttoned, his white shirt open at the collar revealing a glimpse of tanned skin. Dark hair swept back from a face built from strong angles and hard lines, the kind of face that made you think of Roman emperors and Renaissance paintings. His eyes, the same deep brown as his father's but sharper, clearer, burning with an intensity that made me want to look away, scanned the room in one swift, assessing glance before landing on the figure in the bed. 3 men entered behind him, all wearing dark suits and carrying themselves with the same controlled awareness of predators constantly calculating threats. I recognized one of them from previous visits, Roberto, with his graying hair and surprisingly kind eyes, who always nodded politely when our paths crossed in the hallway. Nicholas moved to his father's side with swift, economical strides. He said something in Italian, low and urgent, and Giovanni's eyes opened, focusing on his son with visible effort. The love between them was palpable, even through the drugs, even through what I suspected were years of complicated history. I retreated to my corner near the medical equipment, giving them privacy but staying close enough to intervene if needed. Father and son spoke quietly in their native language, words whose precise meaning I couldn't follow but whose emotional weight needed no translation. There was love there, yes, but also regret, apology, forgiveness, all the complicated threads that bind families together even when they're fraying. Roberto positioned himself near the door, his weathered face drawn with genuine sorrow. His gaze flickered to me briefly, something almost apologetic in his expression, though I didn't understand why. Not yet. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Giovanni's responses grew weaker, his breathing more labored, each word costing him more than the last. Nicholas gripped his father's hand, and I saw the muscles in his jaw working, the only visible crack in his otherwise perfectly controlled facade. At 4:31, Giovanni's oxygen saturation dropped sharply. The monitor alarmed, and I moved forward without thinking, my training overriding everything else. I checked the numbers, adjusted the flow, placed my fingers against his neck to feel the weakening pulse. Nicholas stepped back, watching me work with an intensity that made my hands want to shake. I'd been observed by doctors, supervisors, family members countless times before, but there was something different about his gaze, assessing, measuring, cataloging every movement I made. His lungs are filling with fluid, I explained quietly, forcing myself to meet those dark eyes. I can increase the morphine to keep him comfortable, but beyond that. I let the sentence trail off. We both knew what came next. Do it, Nicholas said. His voice was rough, carrying an edge of something I recognized from years of hospice care, not quite grief yet, but the anticipation of it, the bracing for impact, the desperate hope that you're strong enough to survive what's coming. I administered the medication with steady hands, then checked Giovanni's pulse again. Weaker still, the beats spacing further apart, his body beginning its final surrender. Nicholas returned to his father's side, leaning close, speaking words I couldn't hear. Roberto shifted his weight near the door, crossing himself with a reverence that spoke of deep faith and old traditions. Music swells, then softens. Giovanni Santoro took his last breath at 4:37 in the morning on a rainy November night in Connecticut. The monitors flatlined with a steady tone that seemed to cut through more than just the sound of rain. It cut through 6 months of routine, through the careful professional distance I'd maintained, through the wall I'd built around my heart after losing too many people I cared about. I moved immediately to silence the alarms. That much was routine, mechanical, something my hands knew how to do while my heart processed loss. I stepped forward and checked for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find, my fingers resting against his cool neck for the prescribed 10 seconds before I said the words that would make it official. He's gone, I whispered, though everyone in the room already knew. Nicholas remained perfectly still, his hands still holding his father's, his eyes fixed on the older man's peaceful face. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain against the windows and the quiet sounds of Roberto crossing himself again, murmuring a prayer in Italian that sounded like poetry. I'd been present for many deaths in my career. I'd learned to recognize the different ways people processed loss, the ones who wailed and collapsed, the ones who went numb and distant, the ones who immediately began making practical arrangements as if motion could outrun grief. Nicholas Santoro's grief was locked behind walls of iron control, visible only in the slightest tremor of his hand before he steadied it, in the single slow breath he took before releasing his father's fingers, in the way his jaw clenched once, hard, before relaxing into stillness. Then he stood, straightened his jacket with precise movements, and became someone else entirely. The transformation took seconds. The sun disappeared, replaced by whoever Nicholas Santoro was to the men who worked for him, to the world outside this room, the man who would now carry the weight his father had borne, the man who couldn't afford to be vulnerable or human or broken by loss. But I had seen the crack in the armor. I'd witnessed the moment before the walls went back up. And somehow, that glimpse into his carefully hidden humanity made what came next both inevitable and terrifying. That I moved through the familiar routine of post-mortem care with hands that knew the motions by heart. Closing Giovanni's eyes with gentle pressure, arranging his hands on his chest in peaceful repose, straightening the blankets to restore dignity to death's casual disorder. As I leaned over him, something rose from deep within my memory, a prayer my grandmother had taught me in the Sicilian dialect she'd carried from her village near Palermo. The prayer for the dead, ancient and specific, passed down through generations of women who'd said goodbye to too many people they loved. Luz eterna resplena a idu, signori, e la pace eterna lu camagia. Camina tra lu scuru, ora camina tra la luci. Riposa, caru amicu, e porta siu tia la nostra amore. Eternal light shine upon him, Lord, and eternal peace embrace him. He walked in darkness, now he walks in light. Rest, dear friend, and carry with you our love. I whispered the words without thinking, my voice low, the cadence automatic after years of hearing my grandmother speak this prayer over relatives, neighbors, anyone from the old country who passed. It was a gift, this prayer, a final act of respect, a bridge between the world of the living and whatever came after. When I finished and looked up, Nicholas was staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Not quite shock, but something close, recognition, perhaps, or confusion, or something else entirely that made his dark eyes even more intense, more focused, more absolutely fixed on me in a way that made my breath catch. Where did you learn that? His voice cut across the space between us, sharp enough to make me flinch. I blinked, confused. Learn what? That prayer. Those exact words, that specific dialect. He took a step closer, and I had to resist the urge to step back. Where? I glanced at Roberto, who watched our exchange with quiet interest, then back to Nicholas. My grandmother taught me. She was from Sicily, a small village near Palermo called Corleone. She raised me after my parents died when I was 7. She taught me prayers for everything, for meals, for sleep, for the dead. Nicholas's eyes narrowed fractionally. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied my face like he was reading a book in a language only he understood. Then Roberto stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. Miss Grant has been here all night. She should rest. I can drive her home, make sure she gets there safely. It was a reasonable offer, a kind gesture from a man who'd always been courteous during his visits. But before I could respond, before I could even process the suggestion, Nicholas spoke. No. The single word carried absolute finality, the kind of authority that made Roberto step back immediately without question or protest. She leaves with me. Roberto's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, but he said nothing, retreating to his position near the door like a soldier dismissed from duty. I blinked, exhaustion making it hard to think clearly, to process what was happening. That's not necessary, Mr. Santoro. I can call a car service, or Roberto's offer is very kind. You're coming with me, Nicholas interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He was already moving toward the door, clearly expecting me to follow like everyone else in his life apparently did. I looked at Giovanni one last time, at the peaceful expression death had brought to his features, at the man who'd given me 6 months of purpose and kindness. Then I gathered my bag and jacket, my body aching from hours of standing, from the emotional weight of watching someone I'd grown to care for slip away, from the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from months of night shifts and grief management. I didn't have the energy to argue with a grieving son, especially one who radiated the kind of controlled danger that Nicholas Santoro did, like a storm barely contained, like lightning waiting for an excuse to strike. Roberto gave me a small nod as I passed, something almost apologetic in his expression that I didn't understand. Not yet. But I would soon enough. Sound of rain intensifying. The house was silent as we descended the stairs, the usual nighttime staff apparently keeping their distance out of respect for the family's loss. Outside, the rain had intensified, hammering against the gravel drive like it had something to prove. A black SUV idled near the entrance, its headlights cutting through the downpour with harsh white light. Nicholas held the rear door open, waiting with the patient stillness of someone who never doubted he would be obeyed. I slid into the leather seat, setting my worn bag at my feet, and he closed the door with controlled precision, not a slam, but definite, final, like a chapter ending. He rounded the vehicle and slid into the driver's seat himself. No chauffeur. No additional security. Just us and the rain and whatever conversation he'd decided we needed to have. The engine purred to life with expensive quietness. We pulled away from the mansion, leaving the warmth and light behind, heading into the darkness and rain and whatever came next. Nicholas drove in complete silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile illuminated periodically by passing streetlights. Strong nose, defined jawline, the kind of face that would have been almost too beautiful if not for the hardness around his eyes and mouth, evidence of choices made and carried, of violence witnessed or committed, of a life lived in shadows most people never glimpsed. I watched the raindrops race down the window, each one a tiny transparent world sliding toward oblivion. My mind felt numb, my chest tight with a grief that surprised me with its intensity. Giovanni hadn't been family, had barely been a friend in the professional sense, but he'd been kind. He'd shared stories about his childhood in Italy, had asked about my day, had treated me with a respect I'd rarely experienced in my medical career. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. I wiped it away quickly, turning my face further toward the window, but not before I caught Nicholas's eyes in the rearview mirror, watching me with that same unsettling intensity he'd shown since I'd spoken that prayer, like I was a puzzle he was determined to solve. The highway stretched ahead of us, slick with rain and nearly empty at this hour. I expected Nicholas to head south toward the city, toward my small apartment in Queens where I'd been living for the past year, one bedroom, minimal furniture, the kind of place you stayed because it was cheap, not because it felt like home. Instead, he took the exit toward Manhattan, navigating through streets I recognized from occasional visits but had never truly explored. The city of rich people, important people, people whose problems didn't include medical debt and collection calls and wondering if you could afford both groceries and utilities this month. Where are we going? My voice sounded hollow in the quiet car, competing with the rhythm of windshield wipers. Somewhere we can talk. Not an answer, but clearly the only one I'd receive. I leaned my head against the cool window, watching the city wake up in slow increments. Delivery trucks rumbled past, their drivers starting shifts that would end when most people's were beginning. Early morning workers trudged toward subway entrances, heads down against the rain. The sky was shifting from black to gray, though true sunrise was still an hour away. We pulled up to a restaurant in Little Italy, its facade dark, a closed sign hanging in the window. The name above the door read Lucia's, in elegant script, gold letters on dark wood that suggested old money and older traditions. Nicholas parked directly in front, ignoring the no parking signs like someone who'd never worried about tickets or consequences or the rules that governed ordinary people's lives. He killed the engine and looked at me in the rearview mirror. Come inside. He was out of the car before I could protest, standing in the rain without seeming to notice it, waiting with that same patient certainty. I grabbed my jacket and followed, my sneakers splashing through puddles as I hurried toward the awning where he held open a heavy wooden door. The restaurant interior was beautiful even in darkness. White tablecloths covered small tables arranged with careful spacing, each one set with silverware and wine glasses that caught the faint light from outside. Wine bottles lined shelves along exposed brick walls. The scent of garlic and herbs lingered in the air from the previous night's service, comforting and rich. Nicholas flipped a switch, bringing up soft lighting that cast warm shadows across the space. He shrugged out of his suit jacket, draping it over a chair with economical movements, then rolled up his sleeves with the kind of efficiency that suggested this was routine, familiar. Without a word, he disappeared through a door I assumed led to the kitchen. I stood near the entrance, dripping onto the hardwood floor, unsure what to do. This wasn't a conversation we needed to have. I'd cared for his father had died, my job was finished. We owed each other nothing beyond professional courtesy and maybe a final paycheck. But something about the prayer had shaken him. I'd seen it in his face, the shock followed by sharp calculation, the way his entire body had tensed when I'd spoken those ancient words over his father's body. Nicholas emerged carrying a small tray. An espresso machine hissed in the background, filling the space with the rich aroma of Italian coffee. He set the tray on the nearest table, a basket of bread that looked homemade, a small dish of olive oil mixed with herbs and spices, sliced cheese, 2 cloth napkins folded with precision. "Sit down," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. I sat. My exhaustion was too deep to argue with a man who clearly wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no, who probably had people executed for less defiance than I was currently considering. He returned with 2 small cups of espresso, the rich aroma cutting through my fatigue like a promise of consciousness. He placed one in front of me with surprising gentleness, then settled into the chair across the table, his dark eyes fixed on my face with that intense focus that made me feel simultaneously visible and exposed. "The prayer you spoke over my father," he began without preamble. "That specific dialect isn't common. Even in Sicily, only certain villages still use those exact phrases. The cadence, the word choices, they're from a very particular region." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, grateful for the heat against my cold fingers. My grandmother was very traditional. She came to America when she was 19, but she never really left the old country behind. She taught me prayers for everything, for meals, for sleep, for the dead, for safe travels, for good weather. Every occasion had its specific prayer, its particular words. Where exactly was she from? His voice was carefully neutral, but I heard the tension underneath. "A village called Corleone." Something flickered across his expression, recognition, surprise, something else I couldn't name. He picked up his espresso, drained it in one practiced motion like someone who'd been raised on the stuff, then set the cup down with a soft click against the saucer. "My grandmother was from a village 20 miles from there. I spent summers in Sicily as a child, before." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Before my father brought me into the family business full-time." The weight behind those words was unmistakable. This wasn't just a career change he was describing, this was a life sentence, a destiny chosen for him before he was old enough to understand what he was agreeing to. I tore off a piece of bread, dipping it in the olive oil to give my hands something to do, to ground myself in the physical world when this conversation felt increasingly surreal. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said quietly, meaning it. "Your father was a good man. At least, he was kind to me." "He liked you," Nicholas said, his voice softening fractionally. "He told me you treated him with dignity. That you never looked at him with pity or fear." "Why would I fear him? He was a dying man who wanted company, who needed medical care and someone to talk to during the long nights." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, studying me with unnerving intensity. "You really don't know who we are, do you? I know you're wealthy. I know you have significant security. I assumed you were involved in something that required discretion." I met his gaze steadily. "It wasn't my business to know more than that." "That's an exceptionally diplomatic way of saying you suspected we were criminals." My cheeks heated. "It wasn't my business to know," I repeated. "The agency was very clear about that when they hired me. And you needed the money badly enough not to ask questions." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, but it stung regardless. "Yes," I admitted, lifting my chin. "I needed the money. My grandmother died 2 years ago, after 3 years of slow decline that I handled mostly alone because I couldn't afford professional care and wouldn't put her in a facility where she'd be terrified. The hospital bills from her final months destroyed me financially. I couldn't get regular nursing work because potential employers would see the debt and assume I was unstable or desperate. The agency offered 3 times the standard rate, cash advances, and discretion. I took it because I was desperate." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" Nicholas reached for the bread, tearing off a piece with deliberate slowness. "Your honesty is refreshing. Most people in your position would try to pretend nobility, claim they took the job out of compassion for an elderly patient." "I did have compassion for your father," I said firmly. "But I also needed to eat and pay rent. Both things can be true. I'm tired of pretending that sacrifice is only noble if it's completely selfless. My grandmother taught me that survival is its own form of dignity. A ghost of something that might have been respect crossed his face. He ate the bread, chewing thoughtfully, then poured olive oil onto his own plate with practiced ease. My father was the head of a large organization, he said, his tone conversational despite the gravity of his words. An organization involved in activities that exist outside legal boundaries. Import, export, protection, territorial agreements with other groups who operate similarly. Do you understand what I'm telling you? My stomach tightened. The espresso suddenly tasted bitter on my tongue. I set down my bread. You're telling me he was a criminal, yes. A very successful one for 40 years. And now that role falls to me, along with everything that comes with it. The confirmation hit differently than the suspicion had. Suspecting and knowing were different things. One left room for doubt, for alternative explanations, for the comfortable fiction that maybe I'd misread the situation. The other was concrete, undeniable, terrifying. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas set down his napkin with precise movements, like everything he did was calculated, controlled, deliberate. Because you can't simply go home and pretend the last 6 months didn't happen. People in my world noticed how close you were to my father. How much time you spent in that house. How he trusted you enough to die in your presence, with you speaking prayers from the old country over his body. I was his nurse. Of course I was there. You spoke a prayer in a dialect that connects you to the same region where several powerful families originated. You have access to a house where sensitive conversations took place. You're exactly the kind of person rival organizations look for when they want information, someone with access, with potential knowledge, who can be pressured or bought or threatened. Cold fear trickled down my spine like ice water. I don't know anything. I never listened to his phone calls. I never looked at documents. I did my job and nothing else. I swear. I believe you. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, bringing his face closer to mine. But the Russians who've been pushing into our territory for the past 6 months won't care about the truth. They'll see an opportunity, a woman with access, with potential knowledge, who might be vulnerable to pressure. They'll come for you, Miss Grant. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Then I'll disappear, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I'll move to another city, change my name if I have to. Start over somewhere they'll never find me. That won't be fast enough. His voice was gentle but implacable. They already know who you are. Where you live. Where you work. Who matters to you? No one matters to me, I said automatically. There's no one they can threaten. His expression shifted into something almost like pity. Everyone matters to someone, Miss Grant. And desperate people will try anything. My hands started trembling. I pressed them flat against the table to hide it, but he noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. What are you suggesting? Protection. Temporary, until after the funeral, until the power transition stabilizes and you're no longer an interesting target. My men will watch your apartment, escort you if you need to go anywhere. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. No. The word came out sharper than intended. I appreciate the concern, but I'm not getting more involved in this. I'll take my chances. It's not a chance you'll win. It's still my choice to make. Nicholas's expression hardened. He pulled out his phone, typed something with swift efficiency, then set it face up on the table between us. On the screen was a photo of my apartment building, the entrance clearly visible, people passing by, a timestamp from 15 minutes ago. But what made my blood run cold was the dark sedan parked across the street, windows tinted, positioned perfectly to watch everyone who came and went. My men are already positioned, Nicholas said quietly. Not to trap you, but because I gave the order before I left the house tonight. Before you even understood what you were walking into. The car you're looking at? That's not mine. That's Russians. They've been watching your building since yesterday afternoon. Anger flared hot in my chest, burning through the exhaustion and fear. You had no right. I had every right. You stepped into my world the moment you accepted that job 6 months ago. You sat with my father through his final moments. You prayed over him in words my own mother used to say before she died. That creates an obligation, on both sides. An obligation for you, maybe. Not for me. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet restaurant. I did my job with professionalism and compassion. Your father's death doesn't make me your responsibility or your prisoner. I never said prisoner. Then what would you call posting guards at my home without my permission? Deciding what risks I'm allowed to take with my own life? That sounds like control to me, Mr. Santoro. And I've had enough people trying to control my life for supposed good reasons. Nicholas rose as well, his height forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. We stood there, separated by 3 feet of charged space, two people from completely different worlds who'd been thrown together by circumstances neither of us had chosen. I'd call it keeping you alive long enough to understand the danger you're in, he said, his voice low and intense. I'd call it honoring my father's final wish that the woman who showed him kindness in his last months be kept safe. I'd call it preventing you from becoming collateral damage in a war you don't understand. Maybe I'd rather take my chances than owe anything to a criminal organization. The words hung between us, harsh and unretractable. I expected anger, threats, some demonstration of the power he clearly wielded. Instead, Nicholas simply watched me with an expression I couldn't read, something between frustration and reluctant admiration. My father told me you were stubborn, he said finally, and despite everything, his lips quirked toward something that might have been a smile. He found it amusing. Said you reminded him of my grandmother, who once threw a pot of boiling pasta water at a man twice her size for disrespecting her kitchen. She gave him second-degree burns, but he never disrespected her again. Despite everything, the fear, the anger, the exhaustion, the image made my lips twitch toward a smile. That sounded exactly like something Giovanni would appreciate, would tell stories about with that gleam in his eyes that said he'd witnessed too much violence to be shocked by a grandmother's righteous fury. Nicholas noticed. His expression softened fractionally, some of the hardness leaving his features. I'm not trying to control you, Miss Grant. I'm trying to prevent you from becoming collateral damage in situations you don't understand. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it feels remarkably similar. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair, musing it for the first time since I'd met him. For a moment, he looked tired, actually tired, not just physically but emotionally worn down by grief he couldn't afford to show and responsibilities he hadn't asked for but would carry anyway. I watched my father die tonight, he said quietly, and the raw honesty in his voice made me go still. I'm now in charge of 300 people who depend on me for their livelihoods, their safety, their futures. I have rivals circling like sharks who smell blood in the water. I have internal challenges to my authority that will emerge before his body is cold. And I have a young woman who treated my father with more genuine kindness than most of his own family, who I will not let become a casualty because she's too proud to accept help when she needs it. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. This wasn't the controlled, dangerous man who'd commanded the room at his father's bedside. This was someone carrying impossible weight, making hard decisions, trying to protect what remained of his world while it threatened to collapse around him. I sank back into my chair, sudden exhaustion making my legs weak. I don't want to be part of this, I whispered. I just wanted to do my job, pay my debts, and move on with my life. I know, he said gently, sitting down across from me again. But you already are part of this. The moment you accepted that position, the moment you walked into my father's house, the moment you spoke those prayers, you became connected to us. And in my world, connections matter. They can save you or destroy you, but you can't simply wish them away. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the hiss of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the espresso machine in the kitchen. "What happens after the funeral?" I finally asked. "After these 2 or 3 weeks of protection? You disappear. New city, new name if necessary, enough money to start over properly. I'll make sure you have everything you need to build a life somewhere far from this world. And if I refuse the protection now?" His expression hardened. "Then I'll have your funeral to attend along with my father's. Is your pride really worth dying for, Miss Grant?" The blunt honesty of it struck me silent. Because he was right, wasn't he? Pride was expensive, and I'd already paid too much for it over the years, working myself to exhaustion rather than asking for help, taking on debt I couldn't afford rather than putting my grandmother in a facility, accepting work in morally gray areas because I was too proud to admit I was desperate. 2 weeks, I said finally. And then I disappear. New city, new start, no strings attached. 2 weeks, he agreed. And Olivia? It was the first time he'd used my first name. Something about hearing it in his voice, low, rough, careful, made my breath catch. Yes? Thank you. For what you did for my father. For treating him like he mattered. He did matter, I said softly. He mattered to me. Emotional music swells. And in that moment, sitting in a closed restaurant at dawn with a man who was both my protector and my captor, I realized something terrifying. I was already more involved than I'd ever intended to be. Not just in Nicholas's world, but in Nicholas himself, in the glimpses of vulnerability beneath his controlled facade, in the way he carried grief like armor, in the fierce protectiveness that drove him to make decisions I resented but couldn't entirely condemn. This was supposed to be simple: do the job, collect the money, move on. But somewhere between Giovanni's kindness and Nicholas's intensity, simple had become impossible. And I had no idea how I was going to survive what came next. The apartment on the Upper East Side was nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived, the kind of place I'd glimpsed in magazines without really believing people actually stayed in spaces like this. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a tree-lined street where the autumn leaves were giving way to bare branches. The furniture was modern but comfortable, all clean lines and neutral tones that suggested expensive interior designers and unlimited budgets. A fully stocked kitchen with appliances I didn't know how to use. A bedroom with sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent back in Queens. A bathroom with heated floors that felt like walking on clouds. It felt like a very expensive, very beautiful cage. 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality. I had my phone, my laptop, access to television and books and anything I could want except the one thing that mattered: freedom. On the first morning, I tried the front door out of sheer stubbornness, needing to test the boundaries of my situation. A polite man in a dark suit materialized from somewhere down the hallway before my hand even touched the doorknob. "Miss Grant, please let us know if you need anything. We're here to help." Help. That was the word they all used, like a carefully rehearsed script. The 2 men stationed in the building lobby. The one who appeared whenever I approached the door. Even the woman who delivered meals twice daily, beautifully prepared Italian food that tasted like comfort and imprisonment in equal measure, setting covered plates on the kitchen counter with a professional smile that revealed nothing. Nicholas arrived each afternoon around 4 o'clock. He never called ahead, never knocked. He used a key I hadn't known existed, entering like he owned the place, which, I supposed, he did. Everything in this building probably belonged to him or his organization or whatever euphemism they used for a criminal empire. The first visit lasted 10 minutes. He asked if I needed anything with the careful courtesy of someone checking on a prisoner. I told him I was fine with the cold politeness of someone who resented being imprisoned. He informed me that his father's funeral would be in 2 days, then left before I could formulate a response beyond basic courtesy. The second visit was longer. He brought a laptop, setting it on the coffee table and opening it to show me security footage that made my stomach drop. 3 different angles of my apartment building. A dark sedan parked across the street, windows tinted so darkly they looked like holes cut out of the world. The same car, the same position, hour after hour in the timestamp playback. Russians, Nicholas said, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. Watching to see if you return. My hands trembled as I watched the silent footage. How do you know they're Russian? Because I know the car, the crew, and the man giving orders. His name is Dmitry Volkov. He works for an organization that's been trying to expand into territory my father controlled for 30 years. They're patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when they identify an opportunity. I stared at the frozen image on the screen, at the dark car that looked like 1,000 other dark cars in New York, ordinary and terrifying in its ordinariness. What do they want from me? Information about my father's operations. Names of associates, locations of properties, details about financial arrangements. They think you might have overheard things during your time in the house, phone conversations, meetings, private discussions. I didn't. I swear I never. I know. He closed the laptop with a soft click. But they don't care about the truth. They care about possibilities, about leverage, about finding weaknesses they can exploit. And right now, you represent a possible weakness. Music shifts, becomes more intimate. The third visit changed something between us, some invisible wall that had existed since his father's death began to crack. Nicholas arrived later than usual, after 7 in the evening. His tie was loosened, shadows under his eyes, his usual perfect control fraying at the edges. He looked like he hadn't slept since his father died, which was probably accurate. You should eat something, I said before I could stop myself, gesturing toward the leftovers from my dinner that I'd barely touched. Chicken marsala, roasted vegetables, bread that had probably been baked that morning. He glanced at the containers on the counter, then at me, surprise flickering across his features. You're worried about whether I've eaten? You look exhausted. And grief doesn't excuse skipping meals. Your father wouldn't want you running yourself into the ground trying to manage everything alone. Something in his expression softened, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the role he'd been forced to play. He sat down at the kitchen counter without protest, and I heated the food without asking permission, setting a plate in front of him along with silverware and a glass of water, doing what I'd done for countless patients over the years, providing care, insisting on basics, refusing to let pride or stubbornness interfere with survival. He ate in silence for several minutes, and I found myself studying him in the kitchen's warm light. The strong line of his jaw. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he wasn't carefully styling it back. The elegant movements of his hands, hands that probably signed death warrants and held guns and made decisions that destroyed lives, but that held a fork with surprising grace. My father started grooming me for this life when I was 15, he said suddenly, his voice low and rough. Pulled me out of regular school, brought in private tutors who taught business strategy alongside calculus. By 17, I was attending meetings where men twice my age discussed territories and percentages and consequences. By 19, I was running operations, learning that loyalty is bought, that respect is earned through fear, that showing weakness gets you killed. The bitterness in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. This wasn't just a career he was describing, this was a life sentence handed down before he was old enough to understand what he was agreeing to. Did you want a choice? I asked quietly, leaning against the counter across from him. I don't know. I was too young to understand what I was giving up. My father told me it was our legacy, our responsibility, our duty to the family and everyone who depended on us. He made it sound noble, necessary, inevitable. And maybe it was all those things. But it was also a trap I couldn't escape, even if I'd wanted to. He set down his fork, his dark eyes finding mine. What about you? Your file says you attended nursing school but never finished your degree. Why? The fact that he had a file on me should have been alarming. Instead, I found myself oddly grateful that he knew, that I didn't have to explain from scratch. My grandmother got sick. Dementia first, small things at the beginning, forgetting names and dates, losing track of conversations. Then it got worse. She'd forget where she was, who I was, would wake up terrified in the middle of the night convinced she was back in Sicily during the war. Then she had a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. I paused, the memories washing over me with the clarity of fresh wounds despite 2 years of distance. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. She was my entire family, the only person who'd ever chosen me, who'd ever made me feel like I mattered. I couldn't put her in a facility where she'd be terrified and alone, where she'd die among strangers. So I withdrew from school, became a certified nursing assistant, and took care of her myself. For how long? 3 years. Until she died owing $70,000 to hospitals and specialists and home care equipment companies. My voice cracked slightly. She'd been gone 2 years now, but the debt, and the exhaustion, still sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't put down. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's why you took the job with my father. Not just for money, but for that specific debt. Yes. The collection calls never stopped. Multiple times a day, every day. My credit was destroyed, couldn't get approved for anything, couldn't rent a decent apartment, couldn't move forward with my life. Regular nursing positions wouldn't hire me because they thought I was a financial risk, unstable, desperate. And they weren't wrong. I laughed bitterly. Your agency offered cash, discretion, and enough money to actually make a difference. I would have taken almost any job at that point. Almost any? I met his gaze steadily. I still had lines I wouldn't cross. Your father needed medical care, companionship, dignity in his final months. That made it acceptable, morally gray, maybe, but not actively harmful. I could live with that. Acceptable, he repeated, like he was testing the word's weight. Most people in your situation would use stronger justifications. Would call it noble sacrifice or family duty. It was duty. It was also the only option I had that didn't involve watching my grandmother suffer in a state facility while I finished school. Both things are true. I learned a long time ago that motives are rarely pure, and pretending otherwise is just a way of lying to yourself. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been respect, or recognition, or the acknowledgement of a kindred spirit. You don't lie to yourself. I can't afford to, I said simply. Lies are expensive, and I'm already in enough debt. Music swells with warmth. We talked for another hour after that, the conversation drifting from heavy subjects to neutral territory. He asked about my grandmother's village in Sicily, the narrow streets, the ancient church, the way everyone knew everyone's business and history and secrets. I asked about his summers there as a child, and he described running through olive groves, learning to fish in the Mediterranean, listening to old men argue about soccer and politics in the village square. For an hour, we weren't a criminal and his prisoner. We were just two people connected by grief and Sicily and the complicated legacies of families who demanded everything and gave whatever they could in return. When he left that night, he paused at the door. Thank you, he said quietly. For making me eat. For listening. My father was right about you. What did he say? That you saw people, not roles. That you treated him like Giovanni, not like the head of a criminal organization or a dying old man or any of the other boxes people tried to put him in. My throat tightened. He did the same for me. He never made me feel like hired help. He made me feel seen. Nicholas nodded slowly, something complicated crossing his face. Then he left, locking the door behind him with that same careful precision he brought to everything. I stood there for a long time after he'd gone, my heart doing complicated things in my chest that I refused to examine too closely. Sound of church bells, solemn. The funeral. The day of Giovanni's funeral arrived wrapped in cold November wind and clouds that threatened snow. Nicholas sent clothes, a black dress that fit perfectly, elegant heels, a coat that must have cost thousands. Everything chosen with care, everything appropriate, everything designed to help me blend into a world I didn't belong to. The funeral was held at a church in Little Italy, ancient and beautiful, its interior lit by hundreds of candles. The pews filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of movies about organized crime, men in expensive suits with hard eyes, women in designer black with diamonds that caught the light, faces that carried stories of violence and loyalty and complicated family dynamics. I sat in the back, trying to be invisible. But Nicholas found me, his hand firm on my elbow as he guided me to the front row where family sat. I tried to protest, but his expression brooked no argument, and I didn't have the energy to make a scene in a church full of dangerous people at the funeral of a man I'd cared for. The service was in Italian and English both, traditional and beautiful. They spoke of Giovanni's loyalty, his wisdom, his devotion to family. They didn't mention the criminal empire or the violence or the illegal activities, but everyone in that church knew, and the omission was its own acknowledgement. When it was my turn to view the body, I stood before Giovanni's casket and whispered the same prayer I'd spoken over him in his final moments. Several people in the front row stiffened, heads turning, eyes widening in surprise or shock or recognition. An elderly woman with silver hair and eyes exactly like Nicholas's gripped my hand as I turned away. "You knew the old prayers," she said in accented English. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother, from Corleone." She squeezed my hand harder, tears in her eyes. "Then you are family, in the ways that matter." Giovanni always said the old ways still mattered, even here. Nicholas was waiting when I returned to the pew, his expression unreadable but his presence somehow steadying in a room full of strangers and grief. Music shifts to something darker, more urgent. The moment everything changed. The reception was held at Lucia's restaurant, the same place Nicholas had taken me that first morning. The space had been transformed, filled with people and food and the low murmur of conversations in Italian and English. I stood near the windows, watching the street outside, feeling overwhelmed and out of place and desperate for the 2 weeks to be over so I could disappear and start over and stop pretending I belonged in this world. "Miss Grant." I turned to find Roberto, his weathered face kind but serious. "Mr. Santoro needs to speak with you." "In the office upstairs." My stomach tightened with worry. Had something happened? Were the Russians making a move? Was the protection ending early? I followed Roberto up a narrow staircase to a small office overlooking the street. Nicholas stood by the window, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, his shoulders tight with tension. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Roberto nodded at me and disappeared, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like finality. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Nicholas turned, and the expression on his face made my breath catch. Not anger. Not danger. Something else entirely, something raw and vulnerable and desperate. "The Russians made contact," he said. "They sent a message through intermediaries. They want to meet, to negotiate, to discuss territorial agreements now that my father is gone and everything is in transition." "That's good, isn't it? If they're willing to negotiate." "They also mentioned you. By name. Said they'd be willing to forget any information you might have in exchange for certain concessions. They're using you as a bargaining chip, Olivia. Which means they've been watching longer than we thought, gathering more information than we realized." Cold fear washed through me. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not safe here. Not in New York, not even in America. They have too many resources, too many connections, too much motivation to find you if you stay anywhere they might think to look." He moved closer, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of impossible decisions. "I've made arrangements. Tonight, you'll be taken to a private airport. A flight to London, then connecting to a small village in Scotland where my family owns property. New identity, new papers, enough money to start over properly. You'll be safe there. They'll never find you. Tonight? My voice came out as a whisper. But the 2 weeks. The 2 weeks was a miscalculation. I thought I could stabilize things faster, make you irrelevant to their plans. I was wrong. And I won't risk your life because I miscalculated. Something in my chest cracked. This was it, the ending, the escape, the new start I'd been promised. Everything I'd agreed to. Freedom, safety, a chance to rebuild my life far from this world of violence and danger. So why did it feel like losing something precious? When do I leave? I asked numbly. Midnight. Roberto will drive you to the airport. Everything is arranged. I nodded slowly, processing. 6 hours. I had 6 hours left in this world, in this city, in Nicholas Santoro's life. Thank you, I said formally. For keeping me safe. For honoring your father's wishes. For. Don't. The word came out harsh, and he closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the vulnerability there stole my breath. Don't thank me for sending you away. Don't be grateful for losing you when I just found you. The air between us charged with electricity. Nicholas. My father told me, in one of his last moments when we were alone, that he'd asked God to send me someone who could see past the life I lead to the man I am. He said he thought God had answered, but that I was too stubborn or too blind to recognize the gift. Nicholas moved closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. I thought he was delirious from the medication. But then you spoke that prayer, and you fought with me instead of being afraid, and you made me eat dinner like I was human instead of a monster, and I realized he was right. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. What are you saying? I'm saying that sending you away is the right thing to do. The smart thing. The only way to keep you safe from my world. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And I'm saying that it's going to destroy me, because somewhere between my father's death and tonight, you became the first thing in my life that I wanted more than I wanted power or control or revenge. Nicholas. I breathed his name like a prayer, like a warning, like a plea. Tell me I'm wrong, he said roughly. Tell me you feel nothing, that these days meant nothing, that walking away will be easy. Tell me, and I'll let you go without another word. I should have told him exactly that. Should have lied, should have protected us both from the impossible situation we were creating. Should have been smart, rational, self-preserving. Instead, I told the truth. I can't, I whispered. Because you're not wrong. Because these days changed everything. Because the thought of leaving feels like losing something I didn't know I needed until I found it. The distance between us disappeared. His hands framed my face with surprising gentleness, his thumb brushing my cheek like I was something precious instead of a complication he couldn't afford. I can't keep you safe if you stay, he said, his forehead resting against mine. But I can't let you go either. Tell me what to do, Olivia. Tell me how to choose between your safety and my heart, because I don't know anymore. Music swells with emotion. I thought about my grandmother, who'd risked everything to come to America for a chance at a better life. I thought about Giovanni, who'd lived his whole life in shadows but had found moments of light anyway. I thought about all the times I'd chosen safety over possibility, protection over passion, survival over actually living. What if there's a third option? I asked softly. What if I don't run to Scotland and hide, and you don't send me away to stay safe? What if we find a way through this together? The risks. I know the risks. I spent 3 years watching someone I loved die slowly, helplessly, while I could do nothing but hold her hand and tell her it would be okay even though we both knew it wouldn't. That taught me something, Nicholas. There are worse things than dying. Living without ever really being alive is one of them. His eyes searched mine, desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. If you stay, everything changes. You'll be tied to me, to this life, to dangers you can't fully understand yet. There's no halfway in my world, you're either all in or all out. Then I'm all in, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Because whatever comes next, I'd rather face it with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have had. He kissed me then, soft at first, almost reverent, like he was afraid I might disappear. Then deeper, more urgent, like a man who'd been holding back for too long, finally allowing himself to feel. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to mine again. I can't promise you safety, he said roughly. I can't promise you a normal life or an easy future or anything resembling what you deserve. I don't want easy, I said firmly. I want real. I want honest. I want you, Nicholas. All of you, the man who runs a criminal empire, and the son who grieved his father, and the person who made me eat dinner even though you barely knew me. All of it. Then you'll have it, he promised. All of it. For as long as you'll have me. Music becomes triumphant but bittersweet. 6 months later. Soft morning sounds, coffee brewing, birds, city waking. The apartment in Little Italy became ours, not the safe house on the Upper East Side, but a real home above Lucia's restaurant. 3 rooms, exposed brick, windows that caught the morning sun. A kitchen where I learned to make Giovanni's favorite dishes from recipes his mother had passed down. A life built in the spaces between danger and domesticity. It wasn't easy. The Russians had tested Nicholas's authority 3 times in those first months, and each time I'd watched him transform from the man who kissed me goodnight to the man who made decisions that kept 300 people safe and fed and loyal. I'd learned to recognize the difference, to understand that both men were real, both were him, and loving him meant loving all of it. I went back to school, finishing my nursing degree with money that was probably illegal but that I chose not to examine too closely. Some compromises, I'd learned, were necessary for survival. Some moral lines could bend without breaking entirely. Nicholas taught me to shoot, to be aware of my surroundings, to recognize threats before they materialized. Not because he thought I'd need to fight, but because knowledge was safety, and he couldn't protect me if I wouldn't protect myself. I taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that grief needed to be felt instead of buried, that love was worth the risk even when the risk was everything. The funeral had been 6 months ago, but I still visited Giovanni's grave every Sunday, bringing flowers and speaking to him in Italian I'd learned properly now. Telling him about his son, about the life we were building, about how right he'd been about both of us. You think he'd approve? Nicholas asked one Sunday morning, standing beside me at the grave, his hand warm in mine. I think he already did, I said softly. I think he knew before either of us did. Nicholas pulled me closer, his arm around my waist, and we stood there together in the quiet cemetery, 2 people from impossible worlds who'd found each other in darkness and chosen light anyway. Music softens, becomes contemplative. The life lesson. Life rarely comes with clean choices or easy answers. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations we never chose, facing decisions we never wanted to make. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing we can do is also the most necessary, opening our hearts when every logical bone in our body says to run. The lessons this story teaches us are simple but profound. First, love isn't always safe, and that's okay. The Hollywood version of romance tells us that love should feel comfortable, secure, predictable. But real love, the kind that changes you, that challenges you, that makes you braver than you knew you could be, often comes wrapped in risk and uncertainty. The question isn't whether love is safe. The question is whether you're brave enough to try anyway. Second, people are more than their worst choices. Nicholas was a criminal. That's a fact. But he was also a grieving son, a protective partner, someone trying to carry impossible weight with grace. Olivia needed money desperately. That's a fact. But she was also compassionate, brave, someone who chose kindness even when it cost her. We are all more than our circumstances, more than our mistakes, more than the boxes others try to put us in. Real connection happens when we see past the labels to the human underneath. Third, sometimes the only way forward is through. Olivia could have run to Scotland, started over, chosen safety over uncertainty. And that would have been a valid choice. But she chose to stay, to face the danger, to build a life with someone impossible in circumstances that were less than ideal. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Sometimes the life we're supposed to have is the one we build from broken pieces, not the one handed to us perfect and complete. Fourth, sacrifice isn't noble if it destroys you. Olivia spent years sacrificing herself for her grandmother, for her job, for other people's expectations. But true strength isn't martyring yourself on the altar of other people's needs, it's knowing when to fight for yourself, when to claim what you want, when to say, I deserve this, even when the world says you don't. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't love others well if you've never learned to love yourself enough to believe you're worth fighting for. Finally, family isn't just blood. Giovanni, Roberto, even the men in dark suits who guarded the mansion, they became Olivia's family not through DNA but through choice, through care, through showing up. Nicholas found family in a woman who prayed over his father in ancient words. Real family is built in moments of vulnerability, in choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, in seeing each other fully and loving what you find anyway. Music swells with hope. The deepest truth this story offers is this: life will break your heart. It will put you in impossible situations. It will ask you to choose between safety and passion, between logic and love, between the life you planned and the life that's calling you towards something unknown. And when that moment comes, when you're standing at the crossroads between running away and staying to fight, between protecting yourself and risking everything, remember that you get to choose. Choose brave. Choose real. Choose love, even when it's complicated and messy and dangerous. Because in the end, the only thing worse than a heart that's been broken by trying is a heart that was never brave enough to try at all. Music fades to a gentle, hopeful conclusion. 2 years later. Soft, warm music. The house in Connecticut had been transformed. No more armed guards at every door, though security remained discreet but present. No more hospital bed in the master suite, though I'd kept Giovanni's favorite chair by the window where he used to sit and tell me stories. Nicholas had gradually shifted the family business toward legitimate enterprises, not abandoning everything overnight, which would have been impossible, but slowly, carefully, building something his children could inherit without shame. It would take years, maybe decades, but the direction had been set. I worked 3 days a week at a hospice care facility in the city, using my degree to help other people navigate the same journey I'd walked with my grandmother and Giovanni. The rest of the time, I helped manage the restaurant, had learned to cook properly, had become part of the community in Little Italy that had adopted me as one of their own. And every Sunday, without fail, we visited Giovanni's grave together. Sometimes Roberto joined us, growing older but still loyal, still family. Sometimes it was just Nicholas and me, standing together in the quiet cemetery, grateful for the man who'd brought us together even as he was dying. He'd be proud of you, I said one Sunday, my hand resting on my barely showing stomach, the secret we'd only just confirmed. Nicholas pulled me closer, his hand covering mine over our growing child. He'd be proud of us both. Of what we built from such a broken beginning. And he was right. From death had come life. From danger had come safety. From 2 lonely people carrying impossible weight had come a love that was messy and complicated and absolutely real. It wasn't the love story I'd imagined for myself. But it was the one I'd been brave enough to choose. And that made all the difference.